Hello, everybody. Hello. I know we've got a kind of a they're gonna go ahead and talk. Wait till they get through. I'll try this again. Hello, everybody. I'm glad you're here. You are brave souls in that cold rain, so thank you for coming, and maybe some more will trickle in. Robert is going to teach us tonight. I think he said he's going to start tonight in Luke 16, I think, so if you want to go ahead and find that in your Bible. But before he gets into that, I realize that this is probably, I'm losing count, either my fifth or sixth, might be, I don't know, but it's a bunch of Bible studies like this. We had him in Hickory, and this is the fourth time we've had Robert here, and he has never once told us about what he does in his school and where that is and the trips he leads and all that. So I asked him to take just a couple of minutes. I'm doing this because somebody asked me, is Robert driving all the way from Winston-Salem? And they didn't even know where Gardner-Webb is. So Robert, would you tell us where Gardner-Webb is and what education y'all provide up there and some of the trips you lead? And then we'll get into Luke 16. Let's start with a prayer while everybody's getting their spot. Lord, thank you for our time together tonight. We eagerly come to learn more about what you have to say to us in your word. We know that your word is trustworthy and true, that it gives us a true picture of who Jesus Christ is and who he would have us be. So, Lord, we come with eager hearts and minds to learn tonight. In Christ's name, amen.
Well, thank you, everybody, for coming back this evening on a cold, raw night. So let's see. I'm from Mississippi originally, but I moved away from there when I was about 21 years old, way up north to Louisville, Kentucky, where I went to seminary and earned 2 degrees while there. And from there I went to Kansas City and lived for several years. And then I moved way up north to Des Moines, Iowa, where when I checked my weather app, as I was telling somebody earlier, it was only 10 below. So I thought, this is a summer day down here, so all is good. And then from there I moved to the D.C. area and was a pastor at First Baptist Church, Rockville, Maryland. And from there to Shelby, North Carolina, which is about 11 miles from the university at which I teach, which is called Gardner-Webb University. It's about 20 miles from Spartanburg, South Carolina. It's about 7 or 8 miles from the big metropolis of Gaffney, South Carolina. So you just cross the state line right there, and you're really near Gardner-Webb University. It is a Baptist college. It began as a Baptist boarding school in 1905, and then became a junior college, which it was for a number of years, and then it became a college in the 1970s, and then shortly thereafter became a university. And then in 1993, it began a School of Divinity, and that's what I'm a part of, the School of Divinity. So when I moved to Shelby in 1997 to be the pastor at First Baptist Church Shelby, they asked if I would come out and be an adjunct teacher, and I taught some undergraduate courses in New Testament, Old Testament, some Greek classes and the like. And also I taught at that time in the School of Divinity for their theology classes, and some Greek classes as well. And within about 3 years of doing that, they asked would I come out and be the associate dean of the School of Divinity. Fast forward a couple of years from that, and some resignations happened and other things, and they asked me to become the dean of the school. So I've been doing that for about 15 years. So again, it is a School of Divinity connected to Gardner-Webb University. And the reason I wasn't here last week was because the accrediting agency, you have to be accredited if you're going to, well, you don't have to be, but if you're going to do things the way we want to do things, you need to be accredited. And so that group came to town to visit with us last Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. So I had a meeting with the exiting group Wednesday night about 5 o'clock before they left, and there was no way I could get down here by this time, so that's why we had to postpone or miss last time. While I've been a part of this school for nearly 25 years now, I have also been privileged to lead trips, Bible land trips. We go to Israel, not recently because of the unrest there, but I've been going to Israel on and off for about 25 years. Not only do we go to Israel, we sometimes go down to Egypt. We go over to the country of Jordan. We also go to Rome from time to time. We also go to Western Turkey. And while in Turkey, we go to the biblical Ephesus and other of the churches of the book of Revelation. So we lead our university students get to go on those trips with us, as do usually people from area churches. There's never been a year that I've done this, and we typically will take anywhere from about 25 to 40 people with us. And every time we go, there are always a handful, if not a dozen people who look just like you from the churches that go with us. And while there, we have an on-site guide, and I do typically the biblical interpretation of those particular sites and places, while my guide with whom I work will talk about the history and some of the geography and other kind of things. So that's kind of what I do when I'm not here doing this sort of thing. Is that enough? A question about that? Did that make sense? I'm sorry? Yes, we are. Unfortunately, given the situation in Gaza right now, we've had to punt so far, unless there's a miracle that happens in the next week or two, and there's a great peace that happens in that land. We just haven't gone, because while you could spend significant time in and around Jerusalem and some of the other places, I feel kind of bad taking a group there knowing that we will miss seeing some key places because of the unrest. And so we didn't go last year, and obviously we're not going this year, but we hope to resume making that trip moving forward. We offer 3 degrees at the school of which I'm a part. The Master of Divinity degree, which is the degree that both Philip and I earned, which is and I think Andy has completed his Master of Divinity degree too. That's kind of the basic professional degree for ministry. It's a bit like in a medical school. A person goes to medical school and spends about 3 years doing basic medical training and the like, and then they do a year typically of residency moving forward in their specialization. Well, the Master's of Divinity degree is a 90-hour degree, can only be as short as about 72 hours, so that's a 3-year program in which you learn any and everything related to Bible and theology and ministry and the like. So we have that degree, but we also have a Master of Arts degree in Bible and Theology, which is a 36-hour degree for the person who might not need all the practical ministry courses like pastoral care and counseling and church administration and the like. That person, and could be any one of you as well, you could earn that degree. In fact, I look out across my classes, and not surprising to me at least, but there are folks in our classes who look a lot like you. Some of those classes are online. At least half of them are face-to-face, and many of them are online too. So if some of the things we do in here interest you and you'd like to take a deeper dive into this, I'm your guy. Just talk to me. And we also have a 3rd degree, a Doctor of Ministry degree, a degree that Philip has, and I know Andy is working on his now and will soon be to the end of it. He isn't doing it at our school. That's okay. He's doing it through Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, where I was a graduate once upon a time. So, you're in good hands, and that's that. Okay? All right. So we've been reading the Gospel of Luke together this time around, and you have your outline in front of you if you just want to find your place. We're in the section that would be on page 4, the bottom of the page, at letter E, which is a section that runs in Luke's Gospel from chapter 9, verse 51, all the way through chapter 19, verse 48. You say, well, that's an odd way to break the division up. Chapter 9, verse 51, you'd almost think it would begin with a specific chapter, wouldn't you? But as I think I've reminded us before, the chapter and verse divisions in our Bible, brace yourselves, they're not inspired. The biblical writers who wrote our biblical records did not say this is where the chapter ends or begins and this is where the verse ends or begins. That was introduced to us only, at least the ordering of verses and chapters that we use today, was given to us by a particular Frenchman by the name of Robert, not my last name, but first name, Robert Estienne. And most scholars have concluded that he must have decided where a chapter and verse division was whenever the horse he was riding bobbled, because many a time there's no rhyme or reason why a chapter or verse division should actually show up there. That is what it is. We're not at a loss, however, except when we're reading the Bible. If we're on a chapter-by-chapter reading schedule, as sometimes we are when we read the Bible, well, sometimes something gets lost between the chapter and verse division. This particular section that we're in now, from 951 to 1948, is called the travel section in Luke's Gospel, because Jesus, we are told in 951, has set his face to go to Jerusalem. And on his travel journey, as Luke uniquely tells us, there are any number of incidents or events that we have stories about and records of. The goal, obviously, that Luke is seeking to accomplish in this travel narrative section is to explain in part why when Jesus actually arrives in Jerusalem, things don't go well for him. When he gets there, you know what's going to happen, right? He's going to be put on trial, and he's going to be ultimately crucified. And so Luke is helping us understand in part why the things that he said, the things that he taught, actually lead to Jesus' death. That's important to Luke. But it's important to Luke for another reason other than just to give us those facts about what happens to Jesus. His goal is actually beyond that. Because he, like other of the gospel writers, was inspired to write this gospel some 40, 50 years after Jesus has died and after Jesus has ascended. He's writing it to a particular congregation, to a church, who is facing its own kind of challenges for which they need to know this story of Jesus in the way in which he tells the story. Primarily in this gospel, Luke is addressing a couple of key issues that we've talked about, in our introductory time together, and I emphasize it to you when we actually come to those parts in the text. He's actually doing a couple of things, one of which is, someone would rightly ask, wow, the things that this gospel describes, the things that Jesus does, by all accounts, by the way we think about things, they're simply impossible. These things just don't happen. Now, why do they happen? Well, because this particular person, who is the key personality, Jesus, he's doing some impossible things. Why is that the case? Well, Luke is explaining to us how he can do these things because he is the one who is connected to God and goes way back to the earliest person found in the Bible, whose name was Adam. Because when you read the genealogy in the 4th chapter of this gospel, guess what? It traces Jesus all the way back through the family line all the way to Adam. Whereas when you read the Gospel of Matthew, that genealogy only goes back to Abraham, because Matthew's gospel is addressing another kind of community that is different than the community that Luke's gospel is originally written to. Luke's gospel, most likely, was written primarily to a group of Gentiles, people who were not Jews, who needed to know that this Jesus belongs to what bloodline? The whole human bloodline that goes all the way back, not just to Abraham, but all the way back to Adam. Now, that's an important thing that Luke, again, is putting before us. And moreover, as we've been reading these various stories thus far in this gospel, and I've been trying to focus on parts of this gospel that are unique. That is to say, some of the stories, most of the ones that we've been looking and giving much attention to, they're not found in Matthew. They're not found in Mark. Luke is aware of these events from Jesus' life, and he puts them in front of us. We're looking this evening at some additional parables, not unlike the 3 previous parables that we looked at last week. And you are most familiar with the third of those 3 parables, the so-called parable of the prodigal son. Well, guess what? That parable does not appear in which gospel? Doesn't appear in Matthew. Doesn't appear in Mark. Is not found in John, but only where? Only in Luke. So when you start looking at these unique stories and events that are found in any of these respective gospels, they begin to give you some insight into the purpose of each of the particular gospels in question. So when we read that story about the prodigal son last week, and most of you are familiar with that story. It was preceded, of course, by two other parables. The first of those parables was about a man who lost a particular lamb or sheep. And we're told that he leaves behind the 99 and goes what? Goes in search of the one, which is a really foolish thing. To leave what? 99 healthy, good sheep that are behaving and to go looking for what? For the one lost one. That was just ridiculous. For which any reader would say, it's impossible. No shepherd in his right mind would what? Would do such a silly thing as that. And it's a parable. Jesus is telling and illustrating, in part, what God is about. God is the kind of God who does some seemingly ridiculous things. Now brace yourselves. Among those ridiculous things that God has done is, well, he looked out there and saw you and me one day and said, you know what? I think I'll take that one. I think I'll take him. I think I'll take her. I think I'll add them to the great story. And most of us are shocked, if we're being honest with ourselves. Why would he want the likes of me? Because I know all about me. Now, you only know what I'll let you see about me. But I know all about me. And you know all about yourself too, don't you? You were no fine catch for the kingdom. Sorry to disappoint you. The same way, I was no fine catch for the kingdom. It wasn't as if God were in his heavens wringing his hand and saying, I sure hope Canoy says yes when I call him. No. But it is only by his grace that he looks down and says, this is one I'll call. And I had the good sense to say yes and thank you. And that in part is what's going on in this gospel from start to finish. The least likely people actually appear on the pages of this book. And that's intentional. Because if any one of the characters that Jesus says, come and follow me, were really special, were really talented, and were really creative people before they met Jesus, any one of those persons could rightly say, or anybody else would say about them, well, God picked them because they were what? Really special and really talented. That isn't the way the Bible works. The way God works is he likes to take people who what? Who don't know yet what they might potentially be, and God does what? He does something impossible and turns us into something that we look back on, and at least I do, and I'm shocked at it. Just knowing where I come from and knowing my upbringing and knowing that there was no Christian in my family at all except my mother on my father's side for many, many years in our story. I just look back on that and think, how could all this have happened? So then there's a second story in a parable that precedes this one, which is the parable of a woman who loses a coin. Now, in each of those previous parables, the characters involved, the shepherd who loses a sheep is likened unto God who goes searching for a lost sheep. So Jesus is using an illustration that says, if you really want to know what God is like, God's like a shepherd. And that sounds nice and good to us on the one hand until you really drill down into what a shepherd really is. Kind of stink. That is, they live where? They live outside under the stars and they rub shoulders with animals and the like. And Jesus says, yeah, that's kind of, God is like that. God's like a smelly old shepherd. Okay? And then, shocker of all shockers, in that next parable that we looked at last week, or 2 weeks ago, that I didn't say a whole lot about, was he likens God unto a woman who loses a coin. And so you can only imagine why the Pharisees spit their coffee when Jesus used that kind of an image to say, oh, God's like a woman? Swallow hard. Because in that day and in that age and in that culture, the rabbis and the Pharisees in their writings were explicit. There was a daily prayer that Jews of the day prayed, the men particularly. I thank thee, Heavenly Father, that thou hast not created me a Gentile or a woman. It was well known in that day. And so Jesus tells this startling parable in which he likens God to what? to a woman. And by the time he gets to Jerusalem, are they ready to string him up? You better believe they are. Because they would be saying, as we would looking on, that's just impossible. That would be the way this story plays out. And then, of course, the third of those parables at which we looked, and I'm just setting all this up for what comes in chapter 16. The third of those parables in chapter 15 is the parable of the lost son. So there's a lost sheep, a lost coin, and a lost son, because one of those sons, the younger of the two, has chosen to what? Take half of the family fortune, go off, and waste it on God knows what with God knows whom. And then he says, I'm going to go home. And when he comes home, startlingly, when the father sees him at a distance, the father doesn't say what to the servants? Go out there and run him off. What does the father do? The father breaks and runs to get him. And if you know anything about Jewish culture of the first century particularly, no self-respecting male ever ran anywhere. But the father is pictured in the parable as what? Running with breakneck speed to welcome home this son who has wasted everything, at least half of the family fortune, only to arrive at home to be greeted by his older brother, who is thrilled that his younger brother has come home. No, he isn't. You know the story. So again, it's a parable such that anybody in that day would say, whoa, this is all messed up. How dare this guy named Jesus disrupt the way we know how things really are in life? How dare he use this kind of language to talk about how God really is, because God really likes the good people. God really likes people that are deserving of His love, right? And because you've done good things, that's why you're going to get good things in return. But what does Jesus tell parables about? These kind of people, these despicable people, are the very ones that God says, I'll take that one, I'll pick that one, I'll use that one, I'll take that one. So if you're feeling about yourself in ways that we sometimes do because of any number of things that you might have done in your past, guess what? God says, I got you. I got this. I got a plan for you. And I can turn some what? Seemingly bad pasts into some really, really good things moving forward. So He never gives up on us. Which then leads us to the parable in chapter 16. Are you ready to go there? Here we are. Of all the parables, I actually asked Philip, I said, I bet you if you look back in your sermon file, you probably never preached a sermon on this parable. Because this is one of those really, really interesting parables. It's called the parable of the dishonest steward. Now, before I read the parable, let me just pause to talk about a steward. The actual Greek word here is economist. So this steward is actually a particular word that we meet elsewhere in the New Testament. A steward is the person whose qualities have to be such that he qualifies to be the bishop of the church. You know that section in Timothy where let the bishop be, and here comes this whole catalog of things that person is supposed to be. That's what a good steward is supposed to be about. You will be very careful when you call Philip's replacement. You'll check him out to make sure he passes these qualifications. Well, Jesus is going to tell a parable about a particular steward who is dishonest. So let's listen to it. Here we go. He also said to his disciples, or was saying to his disciples, and again, this is a parable, there was a certain rich man who had a steward, and charges were brought to him, that is to the rich man, that this man, the steward, was squandering or wasting his goods. Now this word wasting or squandering is exactly the same word that the son, the prodigal son, when he went off, guess what he did? He squandered or he wasted everything. So the same word here, and you can see why these parables belong together. Same word is being used here for the wastefulness that this particular steward is guilty of. Verse 2. And he called him and said to him, what is this that I hear about you? Turn in the account of your stewardship, for you can no longer be steward. Okay? So all that so far so good. When Jesus is telling the parable, we're with him. If you what? You mess up like this, dude, you're what? You're done. Okay? And we expect that that's where this is going. But parables will always shock us. Verse 3. And the steward said to himself, what shall I do? Since my master is taking the stewardship away from me, I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. Verse 4. I have decided what to do, so that people may welcome me into their homes when I'm put out of the stewardship. So, verse 5, summoning his master's debtors one by one, he said to the first, how much do you owe my master? He said, verse 6, 100 barrels of oil. And he said to him, well, take your bill and sit down quickly and write me 50. Now, you could just stop right there and say, what? This man owes what? He owes this much, and what did I just do? I just cut his bill in half. Okay? Verse 7. Then he said to another one, how much do you owe? He said, 100 bushels of wheat. He said to him, take your bill and write it for only 80. In other words, I'm going to give you a 20% discount here, right, for what you owe. The master commended the dishonest steward for his shrewdness. For the sons of this world are more shrewd in their dealing with their own generation than are the sons of light. Okay, so before we move on to hear anything further, you got the picture? You see what's happened, correct? You see what is playing out in the parable. So here's this guy who's, he's not a virtuous person. He's done some really ridiculous things. He's mismanaged the money and everything. But he chooses to do this with what goal in mind? To save himself, because once he's done with this job, he can now go to these people for whom he has done this discount arrangement, and you know what they'll do in that culture of that day? They'll say, yeah, man, you can stay here. You can stay here for months if you want to, because what did you do? You helped me out in this way. Now, we look on at that and say, wow, that's pretty unusual. Yeah, that's very unusual. But Jesus is about to score a point that he doesn't want any of us to miss. And he has said as much what point it is he wants us to take away from this already, although he's going to say even more. He says, look, if dishonest people in the world are shrewd enough and clever enough to do such a thing as this, I want my people to do something similar, although I don't want you to do something dishonest. But I want you to be as shrewd and as wise as they are. So because this puts a negative image in front of us, most ministers will say, what? I don't know what to do with that. I just won't ever do a sermon on that. That thing is that's just far-fetched. And that is precisely the point. It's far-fetched. But keep reading with me. Verse 9. And I tell you, now he's talking again to the followers of his, the believers. I tell you, I want you to make friends for yourselves. Remember, this man has made friends by what? Writing off these debts. I want you to make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous mammon. Texts usually say something like that. By means of what? By means of the world's money. Because last time I checked, when you go to the store and if you still use money, if you go to a store, whose money are you using? You're using the same money that what? Good, bad, and ugly people use. We have what? We all use the same money. And we've all kind of thought about that from time to time. Who knows where this dollar has been? But we're all using the same money. So this money is not good money, it's not bad money, it's just what? It's the money of the world. And Jesus is saying, look, people of God, I want you to be as wise with your use of your resources, with your use of your money, as those dishonest people like this steward had been with his. For a particular reason. I want to shatter, I want to bring to an end this bad way of understanding how the culture and how the society around the church is supposed to operate. The world will operate according to this standard, like that of the dishonest person. But I want the church to operate what? Another way. So that, as this story will go on to say, so that when it fails, that's the latter part of verse 9, that when it fails, they may receive you into your eternal dwelling place. In other words, guess what's going to happen with our money? At some point, it may what? It may all come to an end. We may be just like this steward, and we may be what? We may be broke one day as a result of any number of things that might happen. So I want you, Jesus says, to be wise with the money that you have, which is the same common unrighteous money that any and everybody else has. I want you to be wise with the way you relate to one another, so that when the day comes when you're in trouble, what's going to happen? The persons who what? Who live with you and relate to you and who are part of your social network, the church. We're going to take care of each other. Now that's a crazy way of thinking for the first century world, and it's kind of crazy if you think about it even in our own world, isn't it? It's kind of crazy. Because in that day, everything was based upon a person being recognized as having more importance and value than somebody else. It was a clear two-tier system. The haves and the have-nots. And those who had wanted to keep everything that they had, and those who didn't have were always beholden to those who did. And Jesus has already exploded that notion and said that's not the way it's going to be with us. In those who follow me and those who are part of my church, there are no what? There are no two-tier systems here. We are all what? We're all the same. Now, some might have more money than others have, but that doesn't mean that what? That your value is any less than someone else's. We all are of the same value to God. So that when any one of us gets to a place where we no longer have what we once had, we have been so wise in managing what we did have that somebody or somebodies among us will what? Will support us and help us as we move forward. That's shocking in Jesus' day. It's not so shocking in our day because we all know what it's like, don't we? To have found ourselves from time to time in some kind of a situation where somebody helped us out and somebody helped us up, gave us a hand up. And that's in part what Jesus is talking about. Because what's at stake here really is what he's about to say. Verse 10. He or she who is faithful in very little is faithful also in much. And he who is dishonest in little is dishonest also in much. In other words, you either are wise and honest about what you have, or you're not. It's a simple fact. If, verse 11 says, if then you have not been faithful in the unrighteous money that you have, who will entrust you with true riches? And if you have not been faithful in that which is another's, like you're working for, who will give you that which is your own? No servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve, and you've heard this verse at least, you cannot serve God and mammon. In other words, you have to decide whether what you have is what you think you have earned and you have made and it belongs to you exclusively, and whether you're going to live for that, or whether you're going to live in such a way that you know what you have belongs to God anyway, and that with what you have, it belongs to who? It belongs to God, who will use that to help other brothers and sisters when the need arises, which is all part of what you understand the principle of tithing and giving to be in the church anyway. What do we say rightly about our giving and our offerings or whatever? We know, don't we, that the capacities that we have to earn a living, they're not natural to us. Those capacities that we have can easily what? Be taken from us in an instant. We know that. We know that everything that we have comes from God and belongs to God. We understand that. For which reason, when we give to support God's church, God's work, God's kingdom, which is people. That's the truth of the Christian faith, building upon the shoulders, of course, of Judaism before us. So Jesus simply takes some profound principles of old and moves the needle in a much further direction, to the point that he is so destroying the way they understand how culture and society and social reactions and finances, he is so changing the way people look at things that by the time he gets to Jerusalem, they're ready to do what? They're ready to end his life. Because if everybody starts doing this sort of thing, the whole social system, the whole economic system will collapse. And they're pretty committed to their own way of what? Their own way of doing things. So he shocks them and shocks the world. He then goes on, obviously, in the balance of this to talk about the kingdom of God and the lovers of money and such things as this. Which leads him rather quickly, Luke, to move from that story to illustrate. Watch it in verse 19 and following. Another parable. There was a rich man who was clothed in purple and fine linen, and who feasted sumptuously every day. So now here comes the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. You probably are familiar with this story. We meet the name Lazarus in other biblical accounts. But in this particular story, Jesus is telling a parable about a rich man and about a man named Lazarus. And so here's the rich man who is dressed in all the fine ways that one can dress, eats all the fine foods. And verse 20 says, and at his gate every day lay a poor man named Lazarus, full of sores, who desired to be fed with what fell from the rich man's table. Now, understand, in that culture, what fell from the rich man's table. And this is what fell from the rich man's table. In that day, the wealthy would sit at the table and they would eat, and then they would take bread and they would wipe their hands, wash their hands off with the bread, if they had been dipping their hands in the meat dishes, as they always did, or if they were dipping their hands in any of the other things on the table, they would then clean their hands off and they would throw it on the floor. And when they threw it on the floor, the dogs would gather around the table and they would eat up the scraps. Well, here's Lazarus, who in this parable sits at the gate, and he just wants what? He just wants to eat those scraps on the table. It's like, ooh, it's a repulsive thought. Which reminds us somewhat, doesn't it, of the condition into which the second son fell when he was out what? Out wasting the income or wasting the living in the previous parable, 2 parables back. So this man in verse 21, Lazarus, desired to be fed with what fell from the rich man's table. Moreover, the dogs came and licked his sores. So in other words, as he would be beneath the table trying to gather up these scraps, the dogs who were going to be what? Joining him at the table, they were licking his sores. I mean, it's not a very pleasant thought. Verse 22. The poor man, Lazarus, died and was carried away by the angels to Abraham's bosom, which is a shocker because most in this day believed that if you were poor and you were sickly like he was, that was because you were not what? You were not favored by God, and you were not right with God, and you were not blessed by God. So, shocker of all shockers, this particular man, whose life on the surface appears to be cursed by God, is in reality carried at his death where? To Abraham's bosom. The rich man, we are also told in verse 22, also died and was buried. Verse 23. And in Hades, being in torment, he, that's the rich man, lifted up his eyes and saw Abraham far off and Lazarus in his bosom. 24. And he, the rich man, called out, Father Abraham, have mercy on me. Now brace yourselves. And send Lazarus to dip the end of his finger in water and come cool my tongue, for I'm in anguish in this flame. Okay? This man has not learned a thing, has he? This rich man thinks, now even in his tormented condition in Hades, he still thinks Lazarus what? Is his what? Yeah, he still thinks Lazarus is his servant and that he is in command of Lazarus and that Lazarus should go and what? Do whatever he said. He hadn't learned a thing. So far in the parable, when you hear that, you would be rightly shocked to think, what? You mean this guy hasn't learned a thing yet about what to do, what you should be doing with the wealth that you have? All Lazarus wanted was something to eat. And this man wouldn't what? This man doesn't even recognize him. This man walks past him daily at the gate. In the previous part of the parable, he never makes reference to, nor does he ever acknowledge that Lazarus is even on the planet. He just what? He just walks right past him, wearing his fine clothes, eating the fine food. And now he's dead, and now Lazarus is dead, and he thinks the relationship is going to be just the same, or should be just the same. Verse 25. But Abraham said, Child, remember that you in your lifetime received your good things, and Lazarus in like manner bad things. But now he is comforted here, and you're in anguish. 26. And besides all this, between us and you, a great divide or a great chasm has been fixed, in order that those who would pass from here to you may not be able, and none may cross from there to us. In other words, look, you still want to what? You still want things to be the way they were before, but these matters are over and done with. They're changed. This matter has been settled, and you are no longer in a position to command anybody to do anything. Verse 27. And he said, then, I beg you, Father, to send him to my father's house. So he's still what? He's still trying to leverage what he believes to be his power and his authority as someone superior to. He still wants to control things and still wants to be in charge and still wants to tell people. For I, verse 28, I have 5 brothers. And so that he may warn them, send him to warn them, lest they also come into this place of torment. But Abraham said, look, they have Moses and the prophets. And you could say parenthetically, just like you did. They have Moses and the prophets. Let them hear them. And he said, verse 30, no, Father Abraham, but if someone goes to them from the dead, they'll repent. He said to him, if they do not hear Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced if someone should rise from the dead. Now, that's a shocking parable too, isn't it? about how this thing is playing out. And it all comes back around again to a common theme found in this gospel that is carried forward, moreover, into the book of Acts. And that has to do with what we have to do with our money. What do we do with our wealth? The unjust steward, with the wealth that was at his disposal, wisely used it and Jesus uses it as a positive illustration to say, what? You also have access to means and funds. Use them wisely to care for each other. And in this story comes the negative illustration of a man who had what? More than he could ever use, but he failed to acknowledge the need that was right there by them. So that when we come to the close of the parable, we're rightly asking ourselves, or we should be at least, how does this story end? Do the brothers, how do they respond? Do they ever get it? Or do they continue the same pattern that their brother, now deceased, followed? So that's the question for us. Have we learned anything from this parable about ourselves and what we should and how we should not handle the wealth that we have? When you fast forward in this gospel, you won't be surprised at a particular parallel with which this one actually runs track. There's a story after Jesus is raised from the dead, because you did hear him saying this, if even somebody raised from the dead, surely they'll believe him. Do you remember the story when there are two persons walking on the Emmaus Road? It's found only in Luke's Gospel, over in chapter 24. There are 2 people walking on the Emmaus Road. They have recently been to Jerusalem, and what they thought and how they thought things were going to play out in Jerusalem involved this Jesus. They have left there because he got crucified. They've left there skeptical that what? That he was who they thought he was. And they're walking home when suddenly this person from the dead, raised from the dead, Jesus, is walking alongside them. But they don't recognize him. And as they're walking along, talking about various things, talking about the prophets, Jesus is talking to them about the prophets when they're walking along. And when they get home, something happens. Remember what happens when they get home? Which leads me, by the way, to contend that it's probably a husband and a wife. Because we're told it's Cleopas and a traveling companion. Because they go what? They go to their home. And when they get to their home, now the question is, with the wealth that they have, what do they do with it? Will they or will they not welcome this stranger into their house? Because they don't know who it is. And when they arrive at the gate of their house, their home, what do? They invite this what? They invite this stranger in. And when they invite the stranger in and they sit down for the meal, lo and behold, who is it? It is this Jesus who has been raised from the dead. Now, are you able to make the connection here? Do you see what and how Luke is telling these stories in such a way to say to us, look, if the rich man in the previous parable concerning Lazarus had just fed him and had done right by him, their eternal dwelling place would be what? Would be together. But instead, because the rich man would not even acknowledge the person, he ends up where? He ends up in Hades, while Lazarus is where? In the bosom of Abraham. So these two stories become bookends to each other as a reminder to us as the people of God that when we're doing the things that we do with the wealth that we have, we're not doing it because we're thinking that if we do these things, we're going to get to go to heaven. We're doing it because we already understand that what heaven is about anyway is what? All people being the same, no one being better, no one being lesser. The rich man never got it. But we're blessed to read these stories and to be on the receiving end of these stories so that we can yet say, I wonder how I'm using my wealth. I'm wondering who I might see tomorrow or the next day or the next week. I'm wondering who around me needs what? Needs the good news of Jesus Christ connected with the capacities that I have to be of help to them. Luke understood, you see, that his particular community to whom he was writing this message, he knew how fragile things were for many of them. And he's pointing out to them that from Jesus' own story, this is how he instructs, this is how he teaches, this is how he guides. And he isn't done. You see now why they want to get rid of him. This is just not the way you do things. Carry on. Verse 17, chapter 17. He said to his disciples, look, temptations to stumble, they are sure to come. But woe to him by whom they come. It would be better if a millstone were hung around his neck and he were cast into the sea. So, what is the temptation in question here? Based upon everything we've read thus far, what's the temptation so far? Wealth, money. To be so what? To be so driven by that and to be so attached to these things that that's what you're all about. He's cautioning us. That, I'll read it again. It would be better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck than that he were cast into the sea, than that he should cause one of these little ones to sin. Take heed to yourselves. If your brother sins, rebuke him. If he repents, forgive him. And if he sins again against you 7 times in the day and turns to you 7 times and says, I repent, then you must forgive him. I mean, again, this is very strange that this is the way relationships in fact could and should work with us. These apostles said to the Lord, increase our faith. In other words, we don't have enough faith to live this way. And the Lord said, if you had faith as a grain of a mustard seed, you could say to this sycamore tree, be rooted up and planted in the sea. and it'll obey you, as if to say you could put that tree in a salty ocean and it would grow. Verse 7. Will any one of you who has a servant plowing or keeping your sheep say to him when he's come in from the field, come at once and sit down at the table? Will he not rather say to him, prepare supper for me, and dress yourself and serve me till I eat and drink, and afterward then you can eat and drink? Now, what did he just say? He says, if you're a person who has a servant, you're going to require of your servant to do what? To serve you first. Now, again, this is a parabolic expression. Watch how he undoes this. Will he not rather say to him, prepare supper for me first, dress yourself, serve me till I eat and drink, and afterward then you can eat and drink? Does he thank the servant because he did what was commanded? So you also, when you have done all that is commanded you, say, we are unworthy servants. We have only done what was our duty. So what Jesus is saying to that group of disciples and to us, look, if you do everything I've been teaching you here in terms of how you handle your wealth and how you care for other people and how you love other people, don't think that you are going to be specially rewarded for doing that, because you are God's servants anyway, and you are stewards of everything that He's given you. You are on the same equal footing, he says, with persons who have more and persons who have less than you. Be good stewards with what you have. And this kind of thinking, it so disturbed the audiences of that day that they by the time they get to Jerusalem, they are ready and in a hurry to get rid of this Jesus, because he is damaging everything that they understand and everything that they have stood for thus far in their journey. Which brings us then to one more parable here tonight. And there's several in the meantime, but for time's sake, this isn't a parable, but this is the closing story that kind of puts a bookend on this whole frame of teaching here. Chapter 19. In this particular story, you will recognize some characters. This story, once again, appears only in this gospel. This is the story about Zacchaeus. Now, before we read the story, we all grew up singing it, correct? If we went to church. All together now. Zacchaeus was, okay. He was a wee little man, and a wee little man was he. He climbed up in the sycamore tree, for the Lord he wanted to see. And when the Savior passed that way, he looked up in the tree, and he said, Zacchaeus, you come down, for I'm going to your house today. I'm going to your house today. You know the song. Which means, by virtue of the song that we've learned, it means that whenever we think of Zacchaeus, we think Zacchaeus was a what? Yeah, a little short guy, right? Who, he's not going to be even the point guard on the basketball team. He is too short. He's a short little guy. Well, brace yourselves. Chapter 19, verse 1. He entered Jericho and was passing through, and there was a man named Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and rich. So you see how this rich thing, this wealthy thing, this money thing just keeps coming up. And here is who? Here is a man named Zacchaeus, and here he is a tax collector. So Jesus is going to use this guy as an illustration. And we no more than hear rich and tax collector that we already are prejudiced against him. Because persons in question here, they are not rich, and they're certainly not tax collectors, if they do have any money to speak of. Verse 3, and he, being Zacchaeus, sought to see Jesus, sought to see who Jesus was, but he could not on account of the crowd. Because, and here's the first indication, because he was small in stature, most translations say. That's not an altogether bad translation, but what does that mean? Well, if he's small in stature, we have long thought that meant he was a little short guy, small in stature. But there are other ways to be small in stature without being short. That is, in the town or in the place or in the community of which you're a part, you can be a little person. Which means you're a person who's not what? Not held in high regard. Would you say that applies to Zacchaeus? He is not a person held in what? In high regard, because he's a what? He's a tax collector, and he's gotten his money. He's rich. He's gotten his money undoubtedly by less than positive means. Okay? Let's see if you think I'm making this up. So, verse 4 says, he ran on ahead and climbed up into a sycamore tree to see him, for he was to pass that way. So, if there's a crowd of people there, and you know what the crowd thinks about you, that you are a what? What kind of a person are you? You're a person who's what? Small in their eyes. You're not held in any respect. The crowd is the worst place you could possibly be, because what could happen to you in the crowd? You could suddenly be caught up in the crowd, and what might that crowd do to you? They may hurt you, and in a hurry, because they have an opportunity now to get back at you because you are a what? A collaborating, thieving tax collector, and okay, here we go. So now he says, but I really want to see Jesus, but the last place I want to be is with an unfriendly crowd, because all crowds are unfriendly toward my types. So he ran, we are told, climbed up into a sycamore tree, for he, Jesus, was to pass that way. And when Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said, now just pause there, of all the people in the crowd, Jesus chooses what? To pick out this guy, not just because he was a tiny little fella, and the crowd was too big, no, because he's a bad guy. And Jesus says, what? This is a bad guy. Now, do you see now by the time they get to Jerusalem, what they want to do to Jesus? He's not what? He's not spotting the good people in town. He's not going to the nice people's places. He's going where? He likes these bad people. What's wrong with this guy? And when Jesus came to that place, he looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, hurry up and come down, for I have to stay in your house today. And so now the crowds are thinking, what? We knew that he likes to hang out with tax collectors and sinners, and he goes home and he eats with them, and now he's what? He's doing this again? Surely he could pick somebody more virtuous in town than this guy. So, verse 6 says, he made haste and received him joyfully. And when they saw it, we're not surprised, verse 7, they all murmured, he has gone to be the guest of a man who is a sinner. And Zacchaeus stood and said to the Lord, behold, Lord, the half of my goods, and what do your translations say here? The half of my goods what? I what? I give to the poor. Well, it's interesting that our English translations usually put it that way. The half of our goods I give to the poor. It actually says the half of my goods I have been giving to the poor. I have been giving to the poor. So it's not like suddenly what? I'm giving to the poor. But I've been what? I've been doing this all along. Now that makes him a rather what? Unusual tax collector who has been being looked down upon by the people in his proximity there, but I've been giving to the poor. Behold, Lord, the half of my goods I've been giving to the poor, and if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I am restoring it fourfold. And Jesus said to him, today salvation has come to this house, since he also is a son of Abraham. So Zacchaeus already is a what? He already is a son of Abraham, because you hear the word Abraham here, and it takes your mind backward to the previous scene where who is in whose bosom? Lazarus, the poor man, is in Abraham's bosom in the same way that Zacchaeus, because he has already what? He's already understood who Jesus is, and now he gets to see Jesus, and now Jesus comes home and confirms that what? You were living, you were doing with your wealth what I've been telling these disciples they should be doing with theirs, which is giving it to help those who need the help. For the Son of Man, verse 10 says, came to seek and to save the lost. And guess what? It is by our means, our wealth, and the way in which we share it, that the Son of Man this week will do what? Will seek and save some others who are lost. That's pretty good, isn't it? Is my time up? So, to rehearse. Zacchaeus was a what? He was a man of small stature, wasn't he? The people in that cultural context saw him as a what? A lesser person because of his occupation. But Jesus saw him for the person that he was because of what he did with what he had. You and I have what we have, some more, some less, but we are challenged and we are called to do what? To share what we have. This same theme in some verses that we didn't look at, this same theme is played out again uniquely in Luke. There are two people who go to the temple to pray. You know the story. It's only in Luke. There are two people who go to the temple to pray. One of them acknowledges that he's a sinful person, and the other one what? The other one is a Pharisee. And the other one thanks God that he's what? Not like this sinner. Once again, what's happening here? The very ones that we sometimes tend to think Jesus reverses the scenario and says, no, in reality, it's this person who leaves the house of God justified and made right with God because he acknowledges that any and everything that he has no grounds for saying, I'm better than anybody else. He knows that he's what? He knows that he's less than everybody else. And only where the grace of God is present in his life is he able to be everything that God wants him to be. So once again, Luke's gospel does these things and says these things differently than our other gospels do because he's anticipating what actually happens when we get to the book of Acts. That is, God breaks through other kind of barriers. He is no longer confined to the people of Jerusalem. He's no longer confined to the people of Judea. He is no longer confined to the people of Samaria. His gospel and good news goes where? To the uttermost parts of the earth. And then from chapter 9 forward in that gospel account, in the book of Acts, we see the ongoing story of how God moves into the Gentile parts of the world, ultimately crossing the Mediterranean and arrives on European soil, and so the gospel ends up going to the uttermost parts of the world, which is unthinkable if and unless we allow God to do everything that God has planned to do and is doing in our lives. And the rest of the story is, it's still happening. There are still places that God's Spirit and God's witness has not yet arrived, for which reason you probably do something like the churches of which I've been a part at Christmas time. You have a what? Yeah, go ahead and say it. St. Lottie. We have Lottie Moon's Christmas offering. And then we do a similar thing in the springtime because we realize that what? The good news is still on its way to those other places. Those things are important to who we are and what we are about as God's people. And Luke and the second volume of Acts is just one story after another that uniquely makes this plain and makes this clear. So Heavenly Father, we thank you this evening for allowing us to spend the time together that